hello again, and thank you for staying with us. We continue here. Professor Daniel Cash, who's a reader in law at Aston University, says ratings agencies don't treat the Global South fairly. Cash says their assessments shape investor perceptions, influence borrowing costs, and ultimately shape a country's development path. He has also suggested that changes South Africa should champion in the G20 hot seat. Now, the country is set to host the G20 Leaders Summit later this year. Now, Cash joins me live to give us his insights as well. Professor Cash, thank you so much for joining us this evening. You've argued that credit rating agencies don't treat the Global South fairly. Can you unpack what you mean by that and how this unfair treatment typically shows up in practice?
Good evening to you. So, unfair practices and how they treat Global South countries usually comes out in how they interact with the Global South, and a lot of the research and public engagement in terms of this unfairness is really focused on the lack of representation and their ability to be on the ground and know what's happening in these Global South countries. And a good example is that the big three credit rating agencies of S&P Global, Moody's and Fitch collectively only have 3 offices on the African continent, and all are in South Africa. So when they have to rate, for example, Ghana, Botswana, Kenya, whoever it may be, they don't have a presence on the ground. And for a lot of people, a lot of advocates, they suggest that that brings in natural unfairness into how they engage with those countries.
So many believe that ratings agencies are neutral or even data-driven institutions. Where exactly do you see the bias creeping in? Is it about methodology, governance, or even something deeper here?
Well, it's difficult to say. The issue of bias is very much a hot topic, but in reality, it's very difficult to spot bias in any walk of life, and especially when it comes to credit ratings. So a good example is that the methodologies of the credit rating agencies are public. So you can go on their websites and see exactly how they will rate you. To suggest that there's bias in the methodologies hasn't been backed up by the research at all. In fact, the research suggests that there's no anti-African bias, there's only pro-US bias, which is their home country. My argument is slightly different in that the reality is, in a creation of a credit rating, you have different stages, and the methodologies are only one stage. The final stage is what's called a rating committee, is where the analysts will take their methodological understanding into a room with a number of other analysts and senior executives, and between them they will decide the rating. And I argue that if the bias will be anywhere, it will be in that sector at the final stage of the rating process.
Right. But what are some of the concrete examples where you believe that the Global South nations, including South Africa, were downgraded unfairly, if you will, or held to a different standard that countries in the Global North?
Well, it's difficult to say. I think, me personally, I think it's very complex and there's lots of different factors. A few examples that are quite pertinent would be, for example, the way Ghana was treated. Ghana was one of the first countries downgraded in what is now known as the debt crisis. And the way that the agencies and Ghana were interacting was not really conducive of a positive relationship. And that's where you see a few misunderstandings from the countryside, not very clear declarations by the agencies, and this lack of communication really comes together into a negative relationship. And what we're looking at now and trying to develop a lot of initiatives is to turn that relationship into more of a positive, conducive relationship through things like capacity building and shared agreements between the country and the credit rating agency.
Right. But if South Africa, for instance, is to push for reform, what practical changes could be made to how agencies operate or are held accountable?
Well, it's difficult because a credit rating agency, you can't really tell a private credit rating agency what to do. They have to remain independent. It's part of their approach to the markets. They're needed to be independent. Also, they are only really regulated, the big three, in 2 different jurisdictions, in the United States and in the European Union. So it's difficult for, let's say, for example, South Africa to take a meaningful role on changing how credit rating agencies work. What they can do, and what the article discusses, is that they can, in their unique position this year, is harness what they know and what they have worked on and push that into the political sphere. So, for example, on the African continent, there are not many jurisdictions that are as mature as South Africa in terms of their understanding of credit rating processes. Their regulatory framework is very mature, the way they engage is really positive. So, I think South Africa has a lot to share with the African continent. They have this unique power now and role and influence this year with the G20 presidency. And what the G20 has tried to do has not worked. The common framework and other aspects of the G20's approach has not worked because they are using outdated models for a modern world. What I'm arguing is South Africa could be a real pioneer here in pushing a new way of engaging with credit rating agencies. And my argument is starting with capacity building for countries that don't have the experience and knowledge that South Africa has is a natural first step.
Many would agree that South Africa's G20 platform is quite a rare opportunity. What diplomatic strategies would you even suggest to get meaningful traction on this issue without being shut down by dominant financial powers, if you will?
I think what we're seeing here, so I'm in the US this week and I was at the spring meetings, and it was quite clear that the credit rating agencies actually want to come on board. They're usually defensive and they have difficulties coming on board, but you can work with somebody if they want to come forward. And I think that South Africa has a really important role this year where they can be a convening power, bringing the agencies to the table, bringing the sovereigns from the global south to the table, introducing frameworks that everybody can sign up to and agree to. It holds countries accountable, which is important, and it holds the agencies accountable, which is also important. That's why, for example, important aspects such as data disclosure, institutional organization is really critical from the sovereign side. And from the agency side, they need to be much more transparent with how they do things, when they do it, what is good for an agency to receive, what is not good, so that then you increase this communication between parties. And as I'm sure you'll agree, most conducive partnerships are benefited from increased communication, not the opposite.
Professor Cash, as we wrap, if there's one myth or even a misconception about credit ratings agencies that you'd like to debunk for our viewers, what would it be?
I think the biggest thing that I always try to teach my audiences as much as possible is that credit rating agencies are extremely important, but they are not the only factor in the ecosystem. There's a large ecosystem that's affecting the global south, which we really need to take a focus on. So, for example, a credit rating is very critical to the issuance of a euro bond, which is where a country issues a bond and a private creditor will invest in that bond. But they're not the be all and end all. An investor just doesn't rely on a credit rating, and that's all. There are also other players who we need to bring to the table. So, a good example is that the common and famous investment banks like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, they are the ones who actually arrange for those euro bonds, and they are the ones that eventually set the rates. And that's where you have a lot of, particularly African countries, have valid concerns and complaints about the fact that they pay such high rates on their loans, but yet they're 6, 7, 8, 9 times oversubscribed. The reason is that these investment banks set the rates that high that they can guarantee the bond gets sold. And what I'm suggesting is that we need to strip away all of these complexities, strip away all of the misinformation, boil down what the processes are, and then for those of us in the field who are working on Pan-Africanism, on African development, we work there with countries so that they understand what they can get out of that system. Because at the moment, there's a few misconceptions about what African countries can do, what they can't do, how they can speak, who they can speak to. And that's what we're working on now, is trying to really allow African countries to know the ins and outs so that we can have a fair playing field.
There was Associate Professor Daniel Cash, who's a legal scholar at Aston University in Birmingham, really breaking down the complex but crucial issue, and that's of the credit ratings bias and why South Africa has both the platform but also the responsibility to push for reform as well.